Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for being with us today. A recent report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, shows that childhood vaccination rates in the U.S. are dropping and that vaccination exemptions are reaching an all-time high, exemptions being legal allowances to forego child vaccinations for either medical, religious, or personal reasons. Meanwhile, U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is calling the long-established childhood vaccine schedule into question. This is as the country is seeing an outbreak in once eliminated diseases like measles. This has a group of grandparents concerned, so much so that they've created a group called Grandparents for Vaccines, founded by a retired pediatrician. Their goal is to encourage vaccinations by sharing stories of living through deadly diseases that have become preventable with modern medicine, but that they fear will come back if parents continue to opt out of vaccinations for their kids. We're joined in studio today by the founder of Grandparents for Vaccines, retired Shaker Heights pediatrician and grandparent, Dr. Arthur Lavin. Arthur, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Also here with us in studio, we have Patrick Crago. Now, Patrick contracted polio at the age of 5 in 1950. That was 5 years before the polio vaccine came out. Patrick, thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here.
We're also joined on the phone by Ohio Department of Health Director Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff to help us understand what the data shows in Ohio. Dr. Vanderhoff, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, if you in our audience would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org, or you can send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. Dr. Vanderhoff, we'll start with you and just kind of set the stage for this conversation. Can you tell us what are the recommended vaccines for children?
Well, if we're looking at entry into schools, so the kindergarten vaccine requirements in Ohio, there are a grouping of 5 vaccine types that people are probably pretty familiar with. The first is the DTaP, which is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. There's the hepatitis B vaccine, the MMR, which of course is for measles, mumps, and rubella, polio, and last, varicella or chickenpox.
Okay, so as we're looking at that slate of vaccinations, this has been established science for quite some time. Is there a medical reason to be rethinking this right now, Dr. Vanderhoff?
Well, of course, we are always actually looking at our vaccines and monitoring to see what their safety and efficacy are. But as we look at these vaccines that I just mentioned, they all have a very strong track record, not only of safety, but their effectiveness. And we know that these vaccines are important because these diseases have not disappeared. As you noted in your opening comments, in many instances, some of these illnesses have been eliminated from the United States, but we continue to see them reappear because of global travel. Some of them, though, have not been eliminated. So tetanus, for example, tetanus is in the environment, and it causes a very bad condition, a very serious condition known as lockjaw. It's a terrible way to die, but it's completely preventable through vaccination.
And I'll ask you one more question to kind of set the stage here, Dr. Vanderhoff. Can you tell us what are the current child vaccine rates in Ohio?
Well, it's interesting because if we look at the vaccine rates just several years ago, 2017, 2018 school year, in Ohio, we were approaching 90% of kids getting not only all of those vaccines, but all of the required doses. They're multiple dose vaccines. And as we then moved through the next few years, we continued to be very close to 90%. Then starting in 2020, 2021, that school year, we began to see those rates drop at first to 86.5 and most recently in the 24-25 school year to 85.4%. And if we look at the nation, we've seen similar declines.
Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop on which we're having this conversation. Dr. Vanderhoff, we'll have more questions for you in just a moment. But Arthur, I want to turn to you now. As a retired pediatrician and a grandpa, what is it about vaccine rates that prompted you to start Grandparents for Vaccines?
Well, really, Stephanie, the idea was compelled by concerns of grandparents. We're worried about our grandchildren. So I'm really here as a grandfather of 4 beautiful grandchildren. And
you have 4, right?
yes, and they're fully immunized. But as the doctor noted, a lot of our grandchildren aren't getting immunized. Right now, 9 million of our grandchildren in the United States aren't protected against measles, which is raging around the country. And the doctor also mentioned the threat of tetanus, which is everywhere. If you're not immunized, anyone can get tetanus. And so by not immunizing, we're putting our grandchildren at risk for contracting these diseases no one thought we'd see again. Who imagined any of our grandkids having tetanus? So we formed Grandparents for Vaccines so America would hear the voice of grandparents concerned about their grandchildren and invite parents and everybody to participate with us, making sure all of us are protected. You know, all of us are grandchildren, right? So Grandparents Vaccine is really here for to have everyone involved in protecting our grandchildren.
Now, when you talk about the age group of the people that make up Grandparents for Vaccines, you're talking about an age group of people who lived at a time when vaccines didn't exist for some of these things, and now they do. Patrick, for example, you got polio in 1950. You were 5 years old at that time, and that was 5 years before the vaccine came out for polio. So can you tell us, how did having polio impact you then and also now?
Well, when I first got it, the doctor in our local town wasn't sure that I had polio and told me to stay at home for a couple days. But then a couple days later, he concluded I did have polio, and they took me by ambulance to the hospital in Pittsburgh, which is about a 30-mile trip. I spent 3 months in that hospital. The first several weeks I was in isolation, so I could only see my parents through a glass window. And after that, they sent me to a rehabilitation home outside of Pittsburgh, and I spent 11 months there, where they taught me how to walk again with crutches.
Wow.
And I walked on crutches for about 50 years. And then, because polio doesn't sort of, once the acute phase is over, it's not over. And so there's post-polio syndrome, and as you get older, you tend to lose more strength. And so I had to switch to using a wheelchair for the last 25 years.
And Patrick, you are here with us today to talk about getting polio. When you were younger, do you know anyone who wasn't so lucky? That's not always necessarily the result.
Yeah, so I know a couple kids in the area where I grew up, which was a rural area, a couple kids who had it much worse than I did. And one of them I know died. So.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Patrick. We have a call now from Anne in Willoughby. Anne, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. As a parent, I'll make this quick. My oldest child, he has a handwritten vaccination record whereby it's very detailed. It indicates who the manufacturer was, the lot number, the expiration date, and all of that is made available, and we know exactly what my son received, the oldest son. And when my younger children were born, all of that information is not available. So when I requested it, the only thing I received was just a screen. Well, on the computer screen, all you see is the date of the vaccine. And when I requested more information as to the details of the vaccines that my younger children received, I was informed that that is not recorded and it's not made available. So I have no way of knowing what my younger children received as far as who the manufacturer was, the lot number, the expiration, and just that lack of transparency is very concerning. And I was just wondering, why is that information no longer made available to parents? And I wanted to add one more thing. I also checked with the state of Ohio, the health records, and they also don't have any of that information.
Anne, thank you very much for the call. Dr. Vanderhoff, I'll ask you if that's something that you're able to speak to in terms of the data that is available for parents whose children are getting vaccinated these days?
Yeah. So first, in terms of your caller's specific request and concern, I don't have an answer for her. I can tell her, though, that I can ask folks in my department to look further into that if after this we can get her information. I think part of what people encounter now is that everything in healthcare has moved towards electronic medical records. And when a vaccine is given, there is a record made of what vaccine was given and the lot, et cetera. I don't know, though, where that information goes, so we can look into that for her and get more information.
Thank you for that, Dr. Vanderhoff. So Anne from Willoughby, if you're still listening, you can go ahead and send us an email at soi@ideastream.org or call back in to make sure that we have your contact information so we can try and put you in touch with the right people there to maybe get some more direct answers to your very specific questions. Now, Dr. Vanderhoff, I'll ask you, can you tell us the number of children currently unvaccinated in Ohio? I know you shared the percentages with us over the past several years, but wondering if there is a number you're able to share.
Well, I think the best numbers that we can look at are those percentages I gave for kindergartners achieving complete vaccination for all of the required vaccines, because the information in Ohio and nationally is just not collected in a different way. As you may recall, these are multi-dose vaccines, and so that entry point into school is a very good opportunity for us to look and gather together all the information about whether vaccines have been given and whether all the doses have been given. The other thing that I point out is that while we can't really answer that question, how many children in the state are unvaccinated, we do know from that kindergarten data that there are nearly 18,000 Ohio kindergartners who did not meet all of the vaccine requirements. Now, that could mean they were missing one of the 5 vaccines or all 5. We don't know for sure. But nevertheless, 18,000 is a lot of kids who are left vulnerable to potentially very serious but preventable diseases.
Dr. Vanderhoff, can you tell us, how does Ohio compare to the rest of the country when it comes to vaccination rates for children?
Yeah, very good question. If you look at vaccination rates in Ohio and compare them with other states, during the 24-25 school year, our vaccination coverage among kindergartners decreased, as I noted, but it also decreased nationwide. The percentages for Ohio typically place us somewhere in the middle of the country in terms of overall vaccination rates. So there's room both within the national landscape for us to improve. But if we look at the nation as a whole, there is considerable room to improve given the declines we've seen nationally.
There was a report just this morning about the measles outbreak in Canada. And after a sustained outbreak in Canada, Canada has lost its elimination status. So measles no longer eliminated in Canada, obviously in Ohio, that's very close to us. Pat, I'll ask you, tell us how you're feeling about the current measles outbreak reported across the U.S., given what you've been through in your experience with polio.
Well, I think it's kind of alarming. Measles is a very serious disease, and it's so preventable. I mean, how could you not want to get the vaccine?
Let's talk about what's happening here in Ohio now. Dr. Vanderhoff, can you talk to us about the number of measles cases reported in Ohio and let people know how that's transmitted for anyone who might not be aware?
Sure. So in 2025, this year, we've had 44 cases. Interestingly, of those, 42 were unvaccinated and 2 had unknown vaccine status. Now, that's the most we've had since 2022, when we had 90 cases. We had 0 in 23 and 7 in 2024. And, measles is not just a rash. It's a highly infectious condition that can cause very, very severe illness. In fact, if you look at the health complications that can occur, they are particularly impactful for children less than 5 years of age, and they can include complications like pneumonia, encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, and even death. And if a pregnant woman develops measles, that mother can give birth prematurely or have a low birth weight baby. So it's very serious and very contagious.
And in terms of being contagious, what has to happen for someone to contract measles? Can you just be in the same room as someone who's had measles? Do you have to touch an infectious rash? What actually has to happen in order to pass it?
Well, it spreads very quickly from person to person through the air when an infected person enters the room. Just breathing can cause that person to spread the virus. So if you're in a shared space or have even brief contact with a person who has measles, you're at very high risk for contracting the illness. And indeed, when we look at the experience of people being exposed, 9 out of 10 unprotected people around an infected person will acquire measles. And that virus will linger in the air for up to 2 hours.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That's very important to know. I want to remind our audience that we're talking about vaccination rates in children. We have the Ohio Department of Health Director, Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff, with us to tell us about what's actually happening here in Ohio. We also have the founder of a group, Grandparents for Vaccines, with us, Dr. Arthur Lavin, who is here in his capacity, not necessarily as a retired pediatrician, but as a concerned grandparent, and also Patrick Crago, someone who experienced contracting polio before there was a vaccine for it. So if you have a question or a comment, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also send us an email at soi@ideastream.org. Now, Arthur, I want to mention something that's happening in the Ohio House of Representatives right now. Representatives Melanie Miller and Monica Robb Blasdell have introduced a bill that would prohibit schools in part from excluding healthy, uninfected children from attending solely based on their vaccination status during disease outbreaks if they have a lawful exemption. This can be for religious, medical, or personal reasons. And I'm just wondering what you think about that in light of the measles outbreak and the other possibility of diseases that could be contracted.
It's a powerful question, and it brings me back to what Patrick's experience and what he shared with us on air today. And that is, we're opening the door to inviting these diseases that we once vanquished back into our lives. And as grandparents, we have trouble sitting idly by and watching that happen. We're so grateful to Patrick and really thousands of grandparents around the country who have gone to grandparentsforvaccines.com and shared their stories, joined our effort. We're inviting everyone to do that because this movement away from vaccines is very real. The recent report of pregnant women currently pregnant in the United States reveals that about 2/3 of them have decided not to fully immunize their children at this point. So we want to stand up and say, before we open the door wide to the measles you just heard about, to polio, story that you heard directly from Patrick, we have grandparents who share that the story of a 22-month-old child who died of meningitis 2 months before they were eligible, back when the meningitis vaccine was only available 2 years and up. So we know what's going to happen if we let down our grandchildren. And in Ohio and around the country, we're asking everyone to join Grandparents Vaccines at grandparentsvaccines.com to make sure that we can restore the protection that our grandchildren deserve.
And that website is grandparentsforvaccines.com. I want to make sure people have the correct website if that's what it is.
Thank you. That's exactly correct.
Okay. And Patrick, as someone who has had a disease that's preventable today, how does seeing young people get measles, which was previously considered eradicated, how does that make you feel? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's alarming. It's very disturbing to see that they come down with a very horrible disease, really, that's entirely preventable. How can you live with that?
And I want to touch back on that statistic that you shared, Arthur. The 60 to 65% of pregnant women are choosing either to delay vaccinations for their children or not fully vaccinate their children. That was published in JAMA, and it was from researchers at the CDC and Emory University. So just wanted to make sure that our viewers were aware of that statistic, because it's an interesting statistic that I think other people might not necessarily be aware of.
You know, one of the things that we really want to share with people is that today's parents didn't live through the times that today's grandparents did, especially us older grandparents. We're alive when polio, measles, meningitis roamed our childhoods. And so hearing these words, polio, measles, and such, and vaccine preventable diseases, I mean, it sounds very technical, but we're really excited about bringing back the lived experience of what these experiences were actually like, so that people can choose whether to have those experiences in their children's life or not. As Patrick said, and I agree with him, it's alarming. It's alarming that we would invite these tragedies back into our children and grandchildren's lives. So again, we're inviting everyone to join us and make sure that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. And JAMA, by the way, is the Journal of the American Medical Association, just so people are aware. I don't mean to speak in acronyms, but just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. We have a call now from Katie in Oberlin. Katie, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking my call. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share that my mother was born in 1922. So was my father. And they went through a period, where her brother got polio, and he didn't end up as compromised, but he was, paralyzed partially. And I know that the Roosevelt president had this situation too. It was a common ailment. Also, I'm thinking about the women's liberation movement. The women today don't understand what it was like. My mother had 4 children. I had all those common childhood diseases. She had to stay home. She was a stay-at-home mother. But the mothers today don't understand that the understanding about employers is not there. They're going to have to stay home with their children, or the father will have to, one of the parents will have to stay home and take care of that child 24/7. These are serious diseases. And we also don't have that generational understanding of, you've got to have the lights dimmed, you've got to have this, you've got to have that. So many little details about taking care of someone with a disease that's serious is not in the common vernacular and knowledge these days. So it's really important to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that perspective, Katie. We also have a call from Carrie now. Carrie, welcome to The Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my call this morning, and thank you to your guests. This is such an important topic to me because I'm also a grandmother of 2 and am very concerned about this rise in these completely preventable conditions that actually I experienced as a child myself. And I'm wondering from Dr. Lavin, how do people get involved with grandparents for vaccines? What are you doing to get out the word? Do you have a website? Can you answer those questions, please?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. Thanks for the concerns. We all share them. So it's easy. Just go to grandparentsforvaccines.com, and there's a button there. You can hit Join Us and just share your name. And there's another button saying Share Your Story. And we just launched Grandparents Vaccine, this national movement, on Grandparents' Day, September 7th this year. And already we have over 4,000 people who've joined us. We have leaders in over 16 states getting the word out. And the stories, we have hundreds of stories like the ones your viewers have shared with us. And I think, in some ways we can say the vaccines have been a good memory eraser too. They've gotten rid of the diseases, but they've gotten rid of the memories as well. And so as one of your callers, I think, very powerfully put, if you don't have a feel for how dangerous the situation is, why would you be too concerned? And that's where the stories come in, because the stories share lived experiences. Pat's here to share what the reality is like here on the set. Your callers are calling in, and we're getting stories from around the country to say, this is what the world will be like if we drop our guard. So we want to keep that door shut. We want to protect our grandchildren.
Dr. Vanderhoff, I want to ask you now, we've talked about measles and what that's looking like here in Ohio. Are there other diseases that are vaccinatable that we should be concerned about in Ohio?
Well, of course, all of the diseases that are prevented by the list of vaccines I shared are equally important, and all of those are serious conditions. But I'll point one out. Whooping cough, which doctors call pertussis, in 2024, we hit a 14-year high in Ohio with more than 1,700 cases. That's the most we've seen since 2010. And this year, we're on track to still be over 1,000. So a little bit better, but still a very significant number of mostly children who are being impacted by a very serious problem. Now, for many people, the whooping cough will start as a fairly common cold and then develop into a bad cough. But it can, especially for young children, develop into just rapid, violent, uncontrolled coughing fits. And for babies, it can be life-threatening. It's more than just an inconvenience or a terrible time they're going through. In fact, in many instances, they just struggle to breathe. They don't cough. They just can't breathe. And it's a very serious condition. And physicians are always very concerned when we see this happening, especially in the context of families that may have very young children, because we see hospitalizations and just a very serious situation. All of this, of course, preventable by getting the vaccines that we talked about. So I think that's about as clear an example of something that many of us may think of as part of the past. Oh, whooping cough, that's something people used to get. Well, unfortunately, we're getting it again.
Dr. Bruce Vanderhoff, Director of the Ohio Department of Health, thank you very much for your time here on The Sound of Ideas. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And here in studio, Patrick Crago, polio survivor, and Dr. Arthur Lavin, founder of Grandparents for Vaccines. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
We need to take a break now. When we're back on this Veterans Day, we have a conversation with the head of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America organization. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. You're with The Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. It's been 24 years since the September 11th terrorism attacks and initial deployment of troops to Afghanistan. Since 2001, around 2.5 million veterans served in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan and Operation Iraqi Freedom. As those conflicts were ongoing, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America organization was established to advocate for those serving in the Middle East. The head of that organization is Dr. Kyle Ann Hunter, who is a veteran herself, and she stopped by the Idea Center studios in September to talk about the work being done by IAVA with IdeaStream's coordinating producer, Drew Mazias. Now, this conversation is pre-recorded, so we can't take your calls, but please do send us emails with your thoughts. SOI@ideastream.org is the email to do that. Here's Drew with Dr. Hunter.
Dr. Kyle Ann Hunter is the CEO of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America organization, and she joins me now in studio. Dr. Hunter, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
So interestingly enough, we're actually taping this conversation on September 11th, and I wonder what this anniversary means to you now, more than 2 decades later. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have concluded, but it's very much the focus of your work. So how do you reflect on those terrorist attacks and the following several decades?
So it is interesting to be here talking on the anniversary of 9/11, the 24th anniversary of 9/11. And one of the things that is always very sort of stark and telling to me that I have to remind myself of is when we look at our membership. So at IAVA, we are the voice of what we refer to as the post-9/11 generation of veterans. But that really refers to anyone who spent any time serving after 9/11. And the demographic range of that that cohort are, we have folks in their 60s who are part of the initial invasion into Afghanistan. And we have folks that were born after 9/11 that were some of the last to leave Afghanistan. And so when we think about how this event shaped our generation, it shaped a actual generation, right? We were at war for 2 decades virtually after, and there were kids who don't remember that day or don't remember a world pre 9/11 that still enlisted or raised their right hand to serve in conflicts that were triggered by something that they had no memory of. They did not know a world before of. And that always is very telling to me. And I think it really shows how much this event catalyzed and changed the country, that it was still harkened back to by people who didn't remember it, right? Like, I remember it. I'm sure you remember it.
Yep.
Like where we are, there's so many stories of what we were doing on that day. And it makes sense for a lot of people who are like, oh, that's the motivation that caused me to join, right? And when I'm reflecting on it, I can see that for people who are my age or a little bit younger, because I was in slightly before. But when I hear that story from people who were 1 year old, 2 years old, maybe not even born yet at that time, but that's still catalyst. The fact that that could happen here, still driving people to serve, always stays with me. And it also, I think, is a moment that we look at in redefining what service actually means, because I think it's also important, and the gravity of it has reached me more since sitting in this seat, that yes, we talk about the military quite a bit, but the first responder community that was there, at ground zero, they were a lot of the motivation for this organization even starting, right? But we also saw in the sort of immediate aftermath of 9/11, not just people joining the military, but people really getting more involved in civic life and activities, in the sense that we need to serve our communities. We need to come together as Americans first and foremost. And in the 24 years since, we've sort of lost that. Right now, we're drifting further apart again. So when things like this come up, I also really hope they can be a reminder of who we were after that day, how we came together, and how we saw people wanting to be teachers. We saw people wanting to get into volunteer nursing. We saw people wanting to be first responders, right? That real back investment in community is something that I hope these anniversaries can remind us, it was a horrible day, but it can also remind us of some of the best of us who we were after.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the demographic aspect of this, because I actually wanted to ask about that next. And I want you to just start by talking about just the size, the number, the populations that we're talking about here in terms of people that have been involved in these two conflicts, and the difficulties that might present, and the challenges that might present in terms of providing care and advocacy. But also you touched on another thing of how much America has changed, and just how much people personally change in 20 some odd years, and how the difficulties of all that change and that evolution as a country and as armed forces and politically, how that might also pose challenges to the work you're doing.
Yeah. So when we talk about the sort of the generation who served, right, and we can even just talk about those who served in combat, though we advocate far beyond that, but we can start with that demographic, because that was really the launching point for how we got to where we were. What's really stark about this is, when we look at the numbers, right, we talk about the millions of people who are there, it was still less than 1% of our population, right? But it is millions of people who need care. But what's more stark about this generation is it is the most diverse group of combat veterans that this country has ever seen. We saw the opening of a lot of positions to women, and women having a continually increasing percentage, going to, in 2000, pre 9/11, women made up somewhere between 8 and 11% of the armed forces, to by the time we left Afghanistan, they were over 20%, right? So you've got an almost doubling of the number of women. And when we talk about care, that presents new challenges for the VA, because they hadn't been really focused around women's care at all, but then women who have combat-specific exposures or injuries, that becomes important.
Right.
We saw with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there are specific needs for our LGBTQ community that the VA hadn't been set up to care for in an open way. We know we've always had LGBTQ members of the military, the ability to be able to serve openly creates a need to actually allow them to continue to be themselves when they are veterans. We saw things like, the Dreamers programs and how military service really became a pathway for citizenship. So there's these new unique groups that we are really advocating for. But then it becomes I will say it's an opportunity and excitement, but also a bit of a challenge, right? With the more diverse of a group that you are looking to serve, it means we're not all going to agree. And I think what is really unique about our organization is we are member driven. We are driven. We represent over 425,000 of those who served post 9/11, and our advocacy priorities follow what they need, right? This isn't me sitting up there in the headquarters office saying, here's what we're going to do. Right. We actually reach out and ask our members, what do you care about? But also, what do you need? What are you experiencing? What are the trials that you are going through? What are the hurdles and the hiccups? And from that, we've had some really successful wins, both in terms of things like the post 9/11 GI Bill, when it became very evident that education was a struggle for those coming back, and like really being able to fully commit to education just because of the fast pace of deployments that we had. It was a new type of struggle that the Montgomery GI Bill just didn't quite meet, and so we were able to advocate for that. But then also things like the PACT Act to really directly impact the health challenges that we're seeing coming out of this generation of veterans.
Yeah. I want to talk about your background just a little bit before we talk into more of the work that you're actually doing, because it's safe to assume from reading your credentials that this is your life's calling. This is your work to advocate on behalf of veterans. And can you speak a little bit about your time in the service and how that inspired kind of this path forward? Because not every person that serves in the armed forces goes on to work in such a dense public policy sphere like you have. So what was the motivation to kind of have this be the work after being in the service?
Absolutely. So I was a Cobra pilot by my background. So that's an attack helicopter pilot for people who don't know it. Multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, really seeing firsthand what was happening there. Also, I was in the sort of very early phase of women getting into combat aviation that was there. So I experienced some of the real on the ground struggles of what it was to break into a new career field, both in terms of gear and equipment that was going to fit me, but also some of the social pressures that come with it. I was fortunate. I had amazing mentors that helped to guide me through it, but it is different being otherized often when you are there, like just to not put too fine a point on it. And so I had that experience, and then I was very fortunate to get to go to the Hill and work in the Office of Legislative Affairs for the House of Representatives, and that really shaped my desire to be in advocacy, because in that role, I heard from tons of Marines all over the place, right? Whenever anything goes bad, what they say, like, contact your congressman, right? Go. And anytime a Marine would contact, it would come through our office to try to figure out like what actually needs to happen. And hearing it was the gamut of things that we'd hear, everything from why isn't mail getting to my kids on time? And it's like, well, because war is hard. But why isn't mail getting there? To, we don't have body armor that fits us. We don't have the right sort of equipment that's coming here. I'm getting home and I can't get a appointment, and the ringing in my ears won't stop, right? So I started to hear a lot of these stories, right, and see what was actually coming in. At the same time, we were embarking on a lot of very significant personnel changes within the military: the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the removal of the Women in Ground combat exclusion. And sitting in that seat in the Office of Legislative Affairs, senior leaders from the Marine Corps and the DoD would come down and say, like, okay, how do we write the policy? What do we need to do? You understand the law. And so I did what I think a lot of people would try to do, is go say, like, well, what does the research say, right? Like, where does the data drive us to try to connect these new policies we're coming down to what we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, what we might have to do in the future once we leave these. And I found there was a kind of a dearth of research there. There wasn't a ton. There were some that had been great, but there were some that had been old. It wasn't super consistent. And that really drove me to, have this crazy idea to go get a doctorate and be like, I got to figure out how I can link these policies that I see happening with my experience of, my own experience, the experience that I'm hearing, all these stories that have come in, and what the needs of the Department of Defense and the services are, and then what are the needs of these people once they get out of the service, right? So that lifestyle cycle linkage is what drove me into academia, always with the desire that data and research informed advocacy is the best advocacy, is the advocacy that works. Emotions, there's always a lot of emotions that come around a lot of these policy decisions. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing that right now way too much. But data and evidence both give voice to those that are often left out of the story, but also ensure that we have foolproof plans to actually achieve the outcomes that we want. Because I think everyone will say they want better outcomes for those who serve. We want better healthcare outcomes. We want better employment outcomes. We want better housing outcomes. But to get that, we really need to understand what is happening and what the impact of different policy priorities might be. And so that's what I did all of my academic side. And so coming into this seat and really being able to use the culmination of my lived experience as a Marine, my work on the Hill, and then the deep academic research to say, here's how we can build consensus and drive forward in a very pragmatic way, is something that really is a passion, a calling, and a culmination of a lot of experiences for me.
It's a really diverse and kind of robust skill set to kind of bring. You talked about the experience of women in the military and that feeling of being othered. I know you wrote the book Invisible Veterans: What Happens When Military Women Become Civilians Again. What's that kind of personal journey been like in terms of the work for advocating for women, but also advocating for all veterans? Is there a line that you have to tread that's difficult, but also an opportunity, as you said it for an earlier answer?
Yeah, so it's an interesting, I think, personal phenomenon for anyone who's been in the military, where one day you take your uniform off and you're sort of like, huh, what do I do now, right? Yeah. And it's everything from like, oh, I get to choose what I wear today, right? To I can choose where I want to go eat, right?
What my hair is.
What my hair looks like, right? So I think everyone goes through some sort of transition period where they're just like, huh, this is different. Like I wasn't expecting this to happen. But for women, what happened to me and what I found, in writing the book is that women are often the most visible service members, right? You could never blend in. I mean, I remember being in the squadron and just saying like, I just want to make a mistake the same way all the guys in my squadron can make a mistake, because nobody cares. They expect them, right? Like, because everyone makes mistakes, right?
It's normal.
It's normal, right? But if I made a mistake, it was like, oh, see, this is why women shouldn't do something, right? And I was like, all I want to do is like blend in, just because that's, you kind of want to keep your head down, especially when you're young and early on in the squadron. And then, so everybody sees you, right? The spotlight is always on women because they have been such a small cohort. That is thankfully changing. We're getting more women in, which is great. But there still is a very public perception that veterans are men, right? There still is this sort of cultural zeitgeist that, oh, well, men served. And so when women take the uniform off, they often have their own personal, but then sort of out in the world, there's not this, expectation or assumption that they are veterans. Sure. And that has real physical, tangible consequences for women. And the fact of, if we look at something like healthcare, for example, where instances of breast cancer are much higher in women who served, particularly those who were exposed to burn pits and toxic exposures that were there. And there are types of cancers that are much more common in men too. But it is unfortunately very rare that a civilian doctor out in the community will even ask a woman if she's a veteran, right? If she doesn't offer it and volunteer it, which means that they miss screenings that they need, because there are women who are veterans and in part of VA healthcare can get screened for cancer much earlier, or it's recommended, right? Anyone can get screened if they want, right? But it's recommended much earlier. But if you're out in the civilian population, you might miss that. And so from an advocacy perspective, right, being a woman veteran, being someone who has been very involved on the research of women veterans and women in the military, I didn't want to step into this seat with the assumption that I'm only going to advocate for women veterans. But what I found was, when I came in here, is three really interesting and unique things. One is our membership, not just our women members, but all of our members are very, very committed to women's healthcare issues in the VA. And I think it's again, talking back to the diversity of our generation of veterans, most men who served post 9/11 served with a woman. And there's this sense that if you're not taking care of all of us, you're taking care of none of us.
Yeah.
And so that's something I found very interesting, that there really is this desire to support women regardless of one's own gender.
Sure.
The next that I think is important and interesting, especially as we're looking at the policy side, is that investments in women veterans are investments in all veterans, whether that is the research that we need for medical conditions, whether that is the continued investments in childcare that's there, whether it is the establishment of the women's centers at VA healthcare centers that have women's specialty care. Because what we find is when we do research on women, we actually find out learning a lot of things about men. And when we provide services like childcare that are often assumed to be women's services, what we see is they benefit men too, right? Men are also parents. It's not like women are the only parents there. And so we've seen this, like, really this rising tide, that an investment in women is an investment in everybody. And then third is, we're hearing a lot right now about the record number of just people joining the military. If we actually look at the numbers and the data, those historic recruitment numbers are driven by women having an increased propensity to serve. And so we need to keep attracting women, and we will only attract them if they know they're going to be taken care of on the backside. And if we think about right now the types of challenges that our country is facing, they are much more technological in nature, right? We know, we talk about the investment in space that we see. We hear a lot about that right now. The increased discussions about AI, unmanned vehicles. We have, as a country, very deliberately been investing in women in STEM for a generation, a lot of it, right? Like, that is and that's a good thing. We want to do it, right? But that means we have some of the best talent in the world, and the best STEM minds in the world are women. We need to be ensuring that they see military service, they see service to the country as a strong, viable path where they don't only be welcomed when they're in service, but when they're out, they're going to be recognized and able to thrive and live a healthy, continued life of service.
Yeah, it's just another part of a pathway or another
Exactly.
option. Yeah. Well, since we talked about the VA care a little bit, I want to ask about this. Back in August, the IAVA called out the dramatic rise in staffing shortages at VA medical facilities across the country. We have a large VA facility here in Northeast Ohio. This is something that we've looked at on this show. I wonder what the relationship looks like between your organization and the Department of Veterans Affairs. On the surface level, you see the name veterans in your organization's title. You might think there's a close relationship. Is there not a close relationship? What does that actually look like?
Yeah. So we've historically had a very close relationship with the Department of Veteran Affairs. And I think what's been historically very good about the VA is that they want to work with VSOs. And this is something that as a researcher, I often saw, like, getting data, as it were, on veterans. Most of it is veterans who are already in the VA system. Well, what the VA needs is access and data to veterans who aren't in the system, right? The ones in the system, they know how to care for. What we need to know is is blocking those getting to the system. Because if we look at the adverse outcomes, particularly something like suicide, right? So if we think about the suicide epidemic, and whether it's 20 or 22 or whatever the number, we've seen a few of them fudge, 14 to 15 of those have never touched the VA care. Right? But those who have, right, so those who are in the system have better mental health outcomes, have better physical health outcomes. And so we've had this very close relationship historically with IAVA and with all the other veteran serving organizations to be able to really push, like, this is what our members need. Here's how you need to engage with them. Unfortunately, right now, the VA is being more opaque with what they are doing. They're not releasing a lot of information. They're not being very transparent. Not just us, but groups like Disabled American Veterans, Paralyzed Veterans of America, Veterans of Foreign Wars. We've been pushing the VA to say, what is going on, right? We all know the VA needs reform. There's not one veteran serving organization that's going to say, yep, VA is perfect, right? We are good. We are really happy with how things are going. But we want to do it together, right? We want to ensure that our members are being heard. One of our members said it very poignantly a few months ago when I met her, is they said, they say they're not going to cut any mandatory programs. Who's defining mandatory programs? Because I know I don't have a seat at the table. And that's been our concern and frustration, because we do believe, right? Like, we believe the secretary when he says we are recentering the veteran, but we need to, or we want to, I'll say, be a part of ensuring that our generation of veterans is being centered. Because when we see things like, huge mental health shortages, right? That's one of the biggest areas of shortages that we've seen. It feels a little hard to square. We're centering the veteran, but we're continuing to allow these huge shortages to happen in one of the most critical services. We've seen the removal of some of the information about women's health care from the VA's website. And while women are the fastest growing group of veterans, it feels difficult to rectify. We're centering the veteran, but we're removing information about this particular group of veteran. And so we are here ready to work together. We want to work in lockstep to ensure that there is transparency. Veterans deserve transparency as to what's going on. The American taxpayers deserve transparency as to what's going on. And ultimately, the health and well-being of those who served, right? Our most precious asset as a country is those who raise their hand and say, I will defend it with my life. They're going to suffer if we don't have more transparency and we aren't able to work very closely together.
That is Dr. Kyle Ann Hunter, the CEO of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America organization. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Drew and Dr. Hunter. To get the last word on today's topics, you can email soi@ideastream.org. Yesterday, we highlighted new bookstores in Northeast Ohio, and Stephen emailed, with the rise of AI, there is a glut of low-quality books. A physical book is far less likely to be AI written. Maybe that could explain the return to bookshops, and I hope it works because we need to disincentivize the use of AI in art creation. Thank you, Stephen, for the perspective. Tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas, we hear from Democratic candidate for Ohio Governor, Dr. Amy Acton, on November election results. Plus, we talk about career talent development for teens. If you missed any part of the show, hear us again at 9 on 89.7. I'm Stephanie Haney. We'll see you back tomorrow on The Sound of Ideas.